Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in our chats with Emily, as we are calling our readings through the poems of Emily Dickinson contained within the Johnson edition. We turn now to poem 141, Some Too Fragile for Winter Winds. Now, this is a fascinating little poem. We're back to Emily's theodicy, the question of why must there be pain and suffering in the world, and especially infant mortality, or children who are dying. Here, this is going to be a poem about why it is the case that so many children have to die. We'll talk in a moment about some of the stats of infant mortality. It's going to blow your guys' mind. Now, the assumptions are that you've been following our stuff at learnstrong.net, down that left-hand side. Again, Chats with Emily, our playlist. I'm hopeful that you've already been introduced to our set of introductory comments, and again, our big five. What does the text say about epistemology? What you can know, ontology, who you are, psychology and sociology, the study of the individual and the collective mind, and then finally, this notion of theodicy. Why must there be pain and suffering in a world that's created by an all-loving, all-powerful deity, as Emily will grapple with the question. Now, there isn't any question that Emily, as we've said in previous lectures, that Emily, and we just finished with poem 140, An Altered Look About the Hills, that Emily is always playing around with biblical text of one kind or another. Now, there's a passage in Matthew 10, 28 to 31, that Emily's going to be playing with, and it runs like this. Quote, Jesus is speaking, "And fear not them which kill the body, but are not able to kill the soul, but rather fear him which is able to destroy both soul and body in hell. Are not 2 sparrows sold for a farthing, and one of them shall not fall on the ground without your Father. But the very hairs of your head are numbered. Fear ye not, therefore ye are of more value than many sparrows." Now, standing behind this set of lines, I think, is this passage. Emily lived, just to remind you, next to a cemetery, and she was acutely aware of infant mortality. The scholar Aaron O'Neill has pointed out that child mortality rates in the United States for children under the age of 5 was 462.9 deaths per 1,000 births in 1800. This means that for every 1,000 babies born in 1800, over 46% did not make it to their 5th birthday. Amazing. The number of children who would pass. And of course, Emily herself had to witness this as it relates to her brother. So there's going to be an ironic tone of voice here, no doubt about this, as we pick this poem up and enjoy it. Some too fragile for winter winds, the thoughtful grave encloses, tenderly tucking them in from frost before their feet are cold. Never the treasures in her nest the cautious grave exposes, building where schoolboy dare not look, and sportsman is not bold. This covert have all the children, early aged and often cold. Sparrows, unnoticed by the father, lambs for whom time had not a fold. Now, there have been some who have read this poem as Emily's deliberate attempt to attack the very idea of the Matthew 10 passage that we just read. In other words, God knows everything, including the fall of a sparrow. Well, Emily will ask, what about those who are too fragile? Some too fragile, obviously children, for winter winds. Notice the graves are thoughtful, but God is unnoticed, as in unthoughtful. And so you have this interesting tone here going on. The graves are the ones that somehow or another take care of the children far better than does the father. Notice it's the thoughtful grave encloses these children who are too fragile for winter winds. Then she uses the word tenderly. Now, I'm fascinated by this because, of course, we're familiar with that word as specifically Whitman uses it in his treatment of death, and yes, even mentioning children deaths in Song of Myself, passage 6. We'll finish this lecture, in fact, to pick up on that one. Tenderly tucking them, the graves, in from frost before their feet are cold. In other words, a laying child in a grave is kind of like putting a nice warm cuddly blanket over them. Again, notice the ironic tone here. Notice never the treasures in her nest, and of course we're going to finish with sparrows and lambs. In her nest, the cautious grave exposes. Notice first the grave is thoughtful, then it's cautious. Grave exposes. In other words, the grave is there to take care of the child. The ironies obviously abound. building where schoolboy dare not look, and sportsman is not bold. In other words, the schoolboy, and the sportsman don't want to have anything to do with these kind of graveyard scenarios. Then she'll call it a covert. This covert have all the children early aged, and often cold. The word often here is bizarre, because of course we're back to the thoughtful graves, and of course cold has already been used once before, so it's clearly a bit of irony going on here. And then she'll reference the Matthew 10:28-31 passage with sparrows. Sparrows, that is to say these children, she mentioned nests earlier, sparrows unnoticed by the Father. Lambs, again we move from sparrows to lambs, both of these have been significant in terms of representative of children. We can't help but think, of course, of Blake's classics in Songs of Innocence, Songs of Experience, and of course Songs of Innocence, it is what? The lamb, right? Lambs for whom time had not a fold. And again, notice here it's time that she is ridiculing in some way. In other words, these children, they never got a chance to have a life at all. Well, I'm fascinated by her use of tenderly as well as bold. You'll remember in Whitman's Song of Myself 46, I will you to be a bold swimmer. We just finished, as you know, with our conversations of every poem of Whitman's Leaves of Grass, the Deathbed Edition. We call that Talks with Walt. And it's fascinating that Emily and Walt, they were living and working and writing at very close to the same time, and yet never knew of each other, as we understand it, other than by reputation for Emily towards Walt. Of course, Walt never knew about Emily Dickinson, to our knowledge anyway. And yet, this passage that we'll play with here in a second, passage 6 of Song of Myself, it's amazing they were both channeling the same kind of theodicy question. Why must there be children who die? I think at 2a, the argument here is that the death of children is the most tragic of losses, because they never get to have those accomplishments of life and growing and all of that. We think as well, of course, of that classic To an Athlete Dying Young, don't we? At 2b, the Emily's tone here is remarkable. It is an ironic tone of voice, and her word choice, like tenderly, is fascinating. But it's Whitman's Song of Myself, passage 6, that I want to finish with. We've exegeted this elsewhere, but let's just remind ourselves of the brilliance of it. And notice when we get to the word tenderly, a child said, "What is the grass?" fetching it to me with full hands. How could I answer the child? I do not know what it is any more than he. I guess it must be the flag of my disposition, out of hopeful green stuff woven. Or, I guess it's the handkerchief of the Lord, scented gift, and remembrancer designately dropped, bearing the owner's name some way in the corners that we may see and remark and say, whose? Or, I guess the grass is itself a child, the produced babe of the vegetation. Or, I guess it is a uniform hieroglyphic, and it means sprouting alike in broad zones and narrow zones, growing among black folks as among white. Canuck, Tuckahoe, Congressman Cuff, I give them the same, I receive them the same. And now, it seems to me, the beautiful uncut hair of graves. Tenderly will I use you, curling grass. It may be you transpire from the breasts of young men. It may be you're from old people or from offspring taken. It may be if I had known them, I would have loved them soon out of their mother's laps. And here, you are the mother's laps. I'll read it again. It may be if I had known them, I would have loved them soon out of their mother's laps. And here, you are the mother's laps. This grass is very dark to be from the white heads of old mothers, darker than the colorless beards of old men, dark to come from under the faint red roofs of mouths. Oh, I perceive, after all, so many uttering tongues, and I perceive they do not come from the roofs of mouths for nothing. I wish I could translate the hints about the dead young men and women, and the hints about old men and mothers and the offspring taken soon out of their laps. What do you think has become of the young and old men? And what do you think has become of the women and children? They are alive and well somewhere. The smallest sprout shows there is really no death. And if ever there was, it led forward life and does not wait at the end to arrest it and cease the moment life appeared. All goes onward and outward. Nothing collapses. And to die is different from what anyone supposed. And luckier. I find it fascinating that in American thought, the two greatest poets in Whitman and Dickinson, both are playing around with this theodictic question, Why must there be children who die? Why? I mean, it's so unkind. It's so unfair. Finally, at 3b, obviously at 3a, we can think about Milton's Paradise Lost as another example of the Odyssey, no question. What about at 3b? How do you live with this question of the passing of children so early? And how do you come to terms with that fact? I'm hopeful that our study of Emily is challenging you. Thank you.